Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. Today's episode is all about business. We're going to talk about what goes into making a sustainable living from adult game development. Now let's get seedy.
We were asked by a user on Reddit, how do you market your games in order to be able to make a living from them? This is probably one of the most common topics we end up discussing with both aspiring and veteran game developers.
A lot of developers report that monetization and marketing are the weakest areas. And the majority of the topics that we see developers talking about in private do have to do with this monetization and marketing. And with that, we see a lot of misconceptions and misinformation that gets pushed around regarding this topic. And some of the things are just like, hey, this type of content isn't allowed, or hey, you should do this and it's going to make you a lot of money. Or sometimes people just put like, oh, I only created my Steam page 3 weeks ago and then I released my game. And they're like, surprise Pikachu, it didn't do that well. We're excited to share what we know and we're going to dive into that.
Yeah, I think this is an area that I see a lot of other developers have a lot of anxiety or stress around because, yeah, it does feel like for a lot of people that they consider it their weakest area. And as we've talked about before, game development requires, a demonic skill set of being good at art and writing and coding. And, business is obviously a huge part of that if you plan to make it your business. But, it's really hard to be good at all of the things. And, I do also, like you said, see a lot of misinformation around this, which I think sometimes fuels some of that anxiety in that it's hard to know who to believe. And, I think like a lot of other areas, you see a lot of armchair experts about this, like Reddit is a perfect example of, and not just with adult game development, but, a lot of the people on r/game dev, for example, have never successfully sold or, shipped a game or are not doing game dev as their full-time job. And so it's easy for them to be like, oh, it's really hard or it's just not possible. But, I think the best thing that you can do if you're trying to learn how to do something is go and seek out the people that have actually done it successfully and then ask them how they did it, as opposed to listening to a lot of the naysayers who, either haven't tried it because it seems too hard or have tried and failed. And therefore they only know what doesn't work, but not necessarily what does work. So, that's something that we have always, that's why we started this podcast, is that we do like to teach and to mentor. And this is something that we have successfully done. This is now 2 years now that we've been doing this full time. And, we certainly see no end in sight. We have a very sustainable business going. So, that's something that we definitely want for other people, is for them to be able to achieve that as well. The reality, though, it's a very difficult question to answer. And we've actually recorded this episode twice already. I think about 6 months ago, we recorded a version of this episode. And then a month ago, we recorded a version of the episode. And both times when I was editing it, it was just like, it just wasn't conveying the information in a way that I felt like would actually be helpful to the people that want to know this. So this is our third attempt. And I think we've, I'm hopeful that we can convey what we've learned in a way that is actually helpful to people. But that even with that said, though, there's obviously no one right way of doing things, but we can share our way that has worked for us.
Just a quick side tangent to what you were saying. You see it all over the place, especially on Reddit, but also on social media in general, that know-it-all syndrome. Like another example is in computer science subreddits, there's a bunch of students and aspiring developers who do exactly what you were talking about in the game dev subreddits, saying, oh, this is how you need to do it to be successful. This is what you need to do. And like you were getting at, like, have you actually done anything? Or are you just talking about it? And they really don't know. And that's the reality of the situation. So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. You got to seek out the people who've actually completed games and actually been successful in this market.
I definitely don't want us to be, know-it-alls, because the reality is that we also, have only known our experience. We know what works for us. We know what hasn't worked for us. And the reality is that there are other successful developers that do this full time that have done things very differently from us. And so there's lots of valid ways to do this. And that's kind of the good news too, is that, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can do some things, quote unquote, wrong and still be successful. We're a perfect example of that. But that would be basically like my overarching advice, though, is that if you're trying to learn how to do something, whatever it is, go to the people that have successfully done that. And, not necessarily listen to the conventional wisdom of people that maybe think that they know what they're doing because they've observed it, but haven't actually done it themselves. Because I've learned from experience that oftentimes the conventional wisdom of just kind of the industry, like, or subreddit or whatever, is often very different than what you learn if you just go and talk to the people that have actually done it. So we hope that this can be a little bit of insight into how things are actually done.
I think that is a theme that's been present in history too, which is, the better marketers, the better or more powerful branding sometimes wins out even over the better products. And it's unfortunate that it happens in that case, but it's the reality of what happens. If you do have the better marketing and the better branding and you're able to monetize it, you can squish the competition that way. And it's definitely been done in the past.
Yeah, I think that would definitely get an overarching theme that we've noticed, which is that, I kind of reject the idea that good marketing can sell I don't want to say a bad game because good and bad is subjective, but I don't think that good marketing can sell people on a game that they don't actually want to play. So, you do have to make a game that people want to play. But I do think that obviously if you have the combination of a game that people want to play and good marketing, then yeah, you're going to crush the competition, as opposed to if you have a game that people want to play and you don't do any marketing at all, you're still going to probably do okay. But it's the combination of those two things that's really a winner.
One thing we want to make clear is that there's no magic cheat code that's going to bring you overnight success. There's not just one thing that you can do that's going to make it all work. You're going to have to do long-term planning. You're going to have to do research. You're going to have patience, and you're going to have to be in it for the marathon, the long run. It's not going to be some short time success. The other reality is it's not an accident. Like once you actually put in that effort, that time, that work, you will find success. And honestly, that's one of the biggest differences between the successful developers and those who have not reached success yet, is they've actually completed products, they've completed their games, and they didn't give up. The other thing I just want to hammer home is that we have done a lot of research and planning prior to actually creating these games, and we knew what was going to sell. It's just we didn't know 100% perfectly what was going to be the best decision to make every step of the way.
Yeah, I think that's something that it's easy for people to kind of you don't know about a developer usually until they're successful. And so it's easy to feel like they just kind of came up overnight. But the reality is that, yeah, anybody in this industry that I know that's doing it full time, that's the result of many years of hard work and planning to get to that point. And it's typically not an accident. And that's kind of the good news and the bad news is that it's, the bad news is that you're not just going to willy-nilly throw together a game and become, a full-time game developer. That's unlikely to happen. But the good news is that if you are intentional, if you do long-term planning, if you do have patience, if you are making good decisions, even if they're not the perfect decisions, your likelihood of success is very high. In fact, I hate to say things are guaranteed, but I do think in this industry, if there's a few things that you do, which is what we're going to talk about in this podcast, I think it's pretty much guaranteed that at some point you will be able to do it full time. Are you going to become super rich? Probably not. Are you going to, be able to do it full time within 6 months to a year? Probably not. But it's very rare, I think, if you look at very specific circumstances. There are basically a few things that you can do that pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to do it full time at some point, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. So as we said, we did a lot of research before we started doing this full time. The Omega did research before starting Prince Suburbia, and that was started in 2017. So it was started based on what we were seeing in the market at that time. And then when we decided that we wanted to make this a full-time job in 2021, I spent about 6 months working on things full-time and kind of getting them set up and doing research before we pulled the trigger and both started doing this full-time. And some of the things that we anticipated as far as our research in planning to do this full time have come true. The number one thing being that we always knew from the beginning that Steam was the ticket to doing this full time. And, I still think that holds true. I think it's very rare, and it's really only, really well-established developers that are able to do this full time with Patreon alone.
I just want to put a quick caveat in there. Originally, with Prince Suburbia, that was 2017. So Steam didn't allow it yet.
Right. They didn't allow adult games.
So at that point, I was only looking at Patreon, because that was the only model that really existed to make money in the Western world off of these games. Yeah, that was true when we started, but that would have never, but the reality is the path to full-time development through Patreon is much harder and almost impossible now at this point. Yeah, it changed very quickly. So when Steam basically put adult games on the platforms, that was the new main breadwinner for sure.
The other thing too that I think that we've learned that we anticipated that has held true is that in order to be a successful adult game developer, you have to be excited about making adult content. And I think that sounds kind of like a duh thing to say, but I'm actually surprised by how many aspiring developers approach us. And from what I can tell, they're not really super excited about making specifically an adult game. I think they want to make games and they want to potentially do it full time. And they see the adult gaming world, that the standards are slightly lower in terms of being able to make a full-time living from game development. And I do think that is true. But the problem is that even if it's slightly quote unquote easier in that the market is less saturated and the standards are slightly lower because there's no, really big AAA developers in this space. If you don't like making adult games, like that's not going to, it's not like a cheat code that allows you to make money making games and you just sprinkle in some sex scenes and now you're, making big bucks. Like that's the piece that I think is a big misconception, but that we knew going into it. And that I think we were both interested and excited about making adult content, specifically. I think both of us are also interested in regular game development as well, but having the adult content in it for us is not a negative. It doesn't ruin our experience of it. It doesn't make us feel like we're making subpar games or like we're not real game developers because we're making adult games. And I think that's a stigma that a lot of people bring into this space. And I don't think that you're going to be successful if you're not specifically excited about the adult content piece.
Right. I agree with you. I do find it very interesting and kind of weird, like you're saying, that these game developers are coming into the adult game space and sprinkling in the adult content. Like they're just putting their toe in the water. It's like you're going to be associated and compared against all these other adult games. What are you doing? Just go the full measure. Like stop pretending like you're not making an adult game.
Right. Yeah. If you're going to make adult games, just be unapologetic about it. Yeah. Just go in, like, don't put your toe in the water. Just go in full force, because it's like being like, oh, I want to make a platformer, but with only a little bit of platforming, like it's just silly to me that, yeah, people seem kind of afraid of the adult content side of it. And I am of the opinion that you really can't be wishy-washy, because you don't really see a lot of super successful games in the space that are only a tiny bit of adult content. At that point, you're just making an indie game, and the standards are higher for indie games. There's nothing wrong with making an indie game with little to no adult content. It's just that you need to be prepared it's a different market. So you need to be prepared to make something that's higher quality and that appeals more to the indie audience as opposed to the adult audience. If you don't put adult content into your adult game, the adult audience is not going to be interested in it. And I think this also kind of ties into something that we learned that we kind of wrongly assumed. And so it's kind of why I always kind of harp on this issue, is because I do see a lot of other aspiring developers and even existing developers in the space having this misconception that we also had when we came into it, but we have since learned now that we actually have games for sale. And so we have that actual data. But one of the things I see happening is that there's a lot more engagement now around adult games, especially adult visual novels. And that engagement is coming from a very small part of the audience. And that small part of the audience is actually not as interested in the adult content. And they see more the potential in the story and the cinematic and the, visuals. And they see the potential in all these other things. And maybe it was adult content that first kind of piqued their interest in it, but they're not playing it now for the adult content. And, I think the AVN Lovers subreddit is a great example of this. It's a great community. They're super cool people. It's a really chill place. It's a very fun place to hang out and talk to other AVN fans. But the reality is like, I think that subreddit has less than 20,000 people. And that's like how many views we get on Steam in a day. So it's just not a huge part of the audience. And they're not necessarily representative of it. They're still an audience. They're still a market. But they're not representative of the bigger market. And so if you pay too much attention to what people are saying, you're going to be limiting yourself to a very niche audience, because the majority of adult game players are not participating in any way or engaging in any way. They're just buying games. And so that was something that we also kind of had a misconception about, was that we saw people talking on Reddit and Discord and these other places about games. And then when we started actually selling games, we saw, the people actually buying games want something very different than what the people are talking about, because it's just not as, I don't know, I think there's not as much to say if you're just playing for the porn, right? You don't see people really talking about, you go on to porn subreddits and they're mostly just posting images. They're not talking about it. So I think that's the reality, is that people don't talk about porn much, but that really is the bulk of the audience, is that they're here for the porn.
Right. And to piggyback onto this, some evidence is on Steam. Two of the top games in the space are Being a Dick and Fresh Women. And one thing that you can say for certain that they both share is they both have shit tons of adult content in them.
Yes.
They do not shy away from it. They're very different games as far as the story and the gameplay goes, but that's one thing they share, and that's one thing to keep an eye on. The other thing I was going to mention real quick is, as a game developer, you can make the choice that you want to make a more less adult content kind of game, and then just make it more, like fade to black kind of romance scenes. And, they do that, like we talked about in romance novels before as well, too. It's just your market is going to be different, and most likely in this space, from our experience, it's going to be a smaller segment, like you were saying too.
Right. Yeah. All of this is to say, like, the whole topic of this particular episode is how to make money doing this, how to do this full time. Not in the sense of like greedy, like, oh, get rich quick scheme, but like, if you want to make adult game development your full-time job, then you do have to be kind of intentional about planning for that. And I think sometimes that can kind of turn people off. Like, it sounds like we're being super corporate or greedy or saying, follow the dollar signs, which is not what we're saying at all. But we're just saying that, like, if you enjoy making adult games and you want to make it your full-time job, then there's certain things that you can do that can make it much more likely that you're going to make enough money to make it your full-time job. And one of those things is making an unapologetically adult game. There's nothing wrong with making games that have less adult content, but it's very unlikely that you're going to turn that into a full-time job. That's just the honest truth about it. So you have to kind of take that into your, use that in your consideration of like, am I going to make a game with less adult content and I'm okay with it just always being a part-time hobby game? Like, that's totally cool. But the question specifically for this episode is like, how do you turn it into a full-time job?
Right. The other thing I want to say real quick too is if you're a developer, aspiring developer, and you want to get into this adult game space, like if you're afraid of the stigma, like of having adult content in there, I'll just tell you, it's going to be there anyways. Even if you just sprinkle it into your game, the fact that you have adult content in there and you're going to have to say, yeah, I make adult games or whatever, you're still going to get that stigma. It doesn't matter if you have less adult content or more.
Right. Yeah. There's no reason. Yeah. Nobody really cares in our experience because we have one game that's much kinkier and then we have one game that's a little bit more vanilla. And I don't feel like either one gets us less stigma in the real world or online. Like, if you're making an adult game, you're making a porn game, people are going to make assumptions about it because a lot of them are never going to actually play it if they're judging you. So that's the reality, is like, if you're going to make an adult game, just lean in. Don't apologize for it. Just make what, don't be afraid to lean into it. And also know that if you don't want to lean into it, that's a valid choice, but it's unlikely to turn into a full-time job. That's just the reality of it.
So a key point we want to hammer home is that successful marketing starts before you even start making the game. And a lot of that goes back to the hard effort and time and research you put into like what kind of game you want to make that you think is going to make money, that you're going to be happy to make. And ultimately, you want to make a game that people want to play. So a part of that research is you're going to want to play the most popular games based on the actual sales. I've already mentioned a couple of good examples, Being a Dick and Fresh Women. Very clearly, they have done very well on Steam, very successful, and you would be very silly to not research and play those games to understand what's drawing these people in. Some other factors are like, how can you gauge the sales numbers? A lot of that on Steam, at least, goes based upon the Steam reviews. So you can look at the number of reviews, not necessarily the positive reviews, but just the number of them, and you can kind of extrapolate it out there. Another thing is you can use something called Steam DB, that's Delta Bravo. If you look at that, that gives you more data. It has charts, it has pricing for various regions. And you can also see the player counts, the peak 24 all-time high or whatever for these games. And that's some more data that you can use to kind of gauge what games are successful, what games have player retention, all that kind of stuff. Another thing is, like we were talking about, like you can compare what a good game is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they marketed and branded well. So ultimately, the sales are what are more measurable to help you find the games and the developers that have done things on a whole better than others as far as marketing, business decisions, what kind of game they made, all the stuff combined. Another thing is to not worry about what you see people talking about or asking for. Typically speaking, there's a very small percentage of players who are very vocal about what they want in games. And, there's some developers and that take this feedback and they think it's the holy grail. Like they want to implement this and they think, oh, if I do this, they said that I'm going to make a lot of money on it and they'll support me. So yeah, maybe that 1 or 2% of people are going to support you by doing exactly what they're telling you to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right decision as a whole, because there's a lot of players who are just silent and they consume your content and they're happy with it, but they're never going to tell you about it.
Yeah, I think that's why this is so important to look at what are proxies for actual sales numbers as opposed to how people think or feel about the game. Because yeah, you can read the reviews, you can read comments about games, you can go into spaces where people are talking about games, you can go to places where people are asking for specific fetishes, and you can even look at like, oh, this game has is like 99% positive versus like 80% positive or whatever. But the reality is like and we definitely fell into that same trap. So this is why we're kind of saying like, we understand the desire to pay attention to those things because they're much more nuanced and it's much more interesting to pay attention to those. But the reality is like there's just no substitution for pure sales. And that comes down to sales numbers. And that the best proxy for that is the number of reviews that something has, or like you said, looking on SteamDB for like number of concurrent players and things like that. Because yeah, most players are just not leaving reviews. They're not engaging. They're not asking for things because they're happy with what's there and they're voting with their dollars. And that's something that's hard to see from the outside, but is the best proxy for if you want to make sales, you need to figure out which games get sales. And something that I was going to say before that I forgot was that I think Being a Dick and Fresh Women are a perfect example of like, to me, it's very obvious why both of them are successful. And yeah, it's because they both have really high quality and frequent adult content. And that's their main focus. I think the reason, I see so many people confused about why Fresh Women has done as well as Being a Dick, because to them, the ones that are really engaged in this space, like on Reddit, on Discord, on other forums, they're more nuanced players that enjoy a wider variety of aspects of the game. And so they look at the two games, and aside from the adult content, they really don't have much in common aside from college setting. But, that's also not, I don't think, a specific requirement for a successful game. Being a Dick has a higher quality story. It has mini games. It has more complex branching. It has more features. It has a lot of other things that Fresh Women does not have. And I see so many people being like, well, why is Fresh Women so popular when it doesn't have all those things that Being a Dick has? And I'm like, to me, it's kind of like, obviously the point is going way over their head, which is that the market doesn't really actually care about those other things. And that's a hard lesson we've had to learn too. We've put a lot of effort into putting lots of complex things into our games, only to realize that our much simpler game, Prince of Suburbia, actually sells better than our more complex game, because that's the reality, is that the market doesn't really care. Individual players may like those specific things. Yes, individual players like it when the music is really good, or like when a game has features. And then, those are the types of players that are going to talk about it. And, but the people buying the game, from what we can tell from pure sales numbers, they mostly just care about the quality and frequency of the adult content, which may be depressing to players that want more from their game than just sex. So I understand the frustration there, but if you are on the other side of it and you're trying to make this into your full-time job, I think just knowing that like you can add other things, and I'm sure that there is some value added to having good music and having good features. I do think that they make the games have a longer shelf life. Like, they're going to be appealing for a longer period of time because they're going to stand up to the test of time better. But the reality is like, you can get away with a much simpler game as long as the adult content is really good. So if you're going to put effort into making something really good, I'm not saying make a shitty game. I'm saying make a really good adult game, but that the adult content should be the focus.
Yeah, I think it's important, to hammer home too, like the difference between the two games, like you've already mentioned, the more simpler one, which is Fresh Women, versus the more complex one, which is Being a Dick. Sometimes people just want to consume the simpler content, and that jives, for example, with TV shows, for example.
Right.
Sometimes you just want to watch shit TV.
Yes,
and
you just want to watch a soap opera.
Because you don't want to think about it.
Right.
But if you want, like, if you have more mind space, more brain power in that moment, maybe you want to consume Being a Dick another night, because that is more complex. You're going to have to think about it and decide what kind of story path you want to go down. So yeah, it makes sense to me why those two games are successful, and why Fresh Women, even though it's simpler, can be super successful too. It doesn't need to be as complex.
Right. And, you don't really see people talking about Fresh Women as much, and you see people talking about Being a Dick a lot. So I think it also comes down to your personal motivations. If your job is to make this, if your goal is to make this your full-time job, then you have to, take that into consideration. But you might also want to be a game that people talk about. And if that's the case, then yeah, you have to make an overall good game that has a lot of things that people can talk about. It's just not necessarily a requirement in order to make sales. And it's also too why, I think it's, again, the whole idea of I see so many players kind of lamenting the fact that there's so many better games, quote unquote, than Fresh Women that have so many less players. And that's a real shame. And I'm kind of like, I guess it is a shame in the sense of like, it's a shame to be part of a niche audience that wants something very niche. Then yes, you're not going to see a lot of content for what you want, because there's not a lot of incentive for developers to make it. But I don't think that it's necessarily a shame for the market overall. Because, it's kind of like saying like, oh, it's a real shame that like McDonald's exists or something like that. I mean, the reality is, like you said, sometimes you just want something that's quick and easy and that is going to taste good. And, what's good is subjective, right? And what's good is not always what's popular, and vice versa. And so, some things are more like the gourmet cooking of games, and some things are more like the McDonald's of games. And, you can decide as a developer which end you want to be on. But I think sometimes it can be kind of comforting to know too that you don't have to make the absolute best game in the space. As long as you get the adult content right, you can then focus on whatever other areas are important to you, but you don't have to get everything right. And if anything, that should be a relief, right? You don't have to do everything to Being a Dick level to be successful. You just have to get the adult content right, and then whatever else is important to you personally that you're going to enjoy making good. So, all that to say too, like I definitely, I hate to come across as, again, like chase the almighty dollar, do whatever is best for profit. That's no way to live. You don't want to make games that you hate. just to make money, because you'll be miserable and you can't sustain that long term. Making a game takes years. So you're not going to sustain it long term if you hate what you're making. And I also want to be clear that for us, that's part of the calculus too. We make games that we like making, but we also just happen to look for like, what's the middle of that Venn diagram? Here's the circle of games that make money, of which there are lots of different types, because again, what's most important is just that it has really a good adult content. Beyond that, there's a lot of options as far as what kind of game you make. And then, the other circle is things that we want to make. And we're pretty easygoing people. So there's a lot of things that we would have fun making. So we just look for like that big circle in the middle of like, these are games that would sell that we would also like making. And we pick from that category. Again, if you have a very specific vision of what you want to do and you have no wiggle room on that, and it's not something that's going to be super popular, there is nothing wrong with that. But be honest with yourself that you're not going to just randomly become an overnight success, because, it's just not ever good to lie to yourself either. Just be honest with yourself that this is going to be a hobby project and there's nothing wrong with that. But don't waste your time trying to make it your full-time job. Just focus on making the game you want to make and have fun with that piece of it.
One last thing I wanted to mention about Being a Dick and the format that it's in, just because it is more of a complex game and it's multi-seasons. One thing, like as a consumer and a player, even not just for research, but just playing it for enjoyment, I will say it's something to consider. Like, do you want to have so many seasons in a game like that? Because as a player, it can seem daunting, for example, just knowing that it's going to be like at least 4 seasons and each season is freaking huge. It's like, that's going to be a whole thing. Like if you're a brand new player to Being a Dick versus somebody who started off when it first came out, and then you're kind of sucked in at that point. In comparison to like Fresh Women, for example, like even if they have 4 seasons, it's not going to be as daunting because that gameplay is not as complex. You're not going to have to think as much as you're making the choices in that game, at least in the current format that it's in. One last thing with that is it's our impression that multi-season games, that each DLC or each season that you put out, it seems like it makes less and less money than just having an original like new game that you put out.
Yeah, that's one big misconception I see from players and even from other developers. And often they're not developers that do it full time. So I think that maybe they just haven't reached the point that they understand that this is how it works. But I've seen so many players and developers say, well, of course, Dr. Pinkcake just keeps making Being a Dick because that's the way to make money. And the reality is like, I think he's made all the money he ever needs to make. So I don't think money really factors into his calculus anymore. But the reality is that you do actually make more money when you make each new game. And as developers who have finished one game and are making a new game, we definitely make more money having a complete game, Prince Suburbia, and then selling a completely different game, A Shot in the Dark, than we would if we just kept making Prince of Suburbia. Like there's no question in my mind, because A Shot in the Dark is its own game that we can sell for full price. Whereas like if we just did, and we do hope to eventually make more kind of additional DLCs for Prince Suburbia with like additional content, but we can never sell those for as much as the kind of original game. And also interest starts to drop off in that like people want novelty. So the reality is like, yes, there are many diehard fans of Prince Suburbia that want to see more of it. So it would certainly be within our best interest to keep making it. And we like making it. And we do want to appease those players and keep making content for them. But the reality is like with each DLC, we would lose some of the player base that just wants something new, that are not diehard fans. And so, I don't know any numbers on this either, but I will not be surprised to see that, the Opie Man, the Fresh Woman developer, not only do they have multiple seasons of Fresh Woman, but they also have another game now in development, a fantasy game. I would not be surprised to learn when they finally get those both on Steam, both season 2 of Fresh Woman and this, Forbidden Fantasy, I think it's called. I would expect the Forbidden Fantasy to sell better than season 2 of Fresh Women, because they still benefit from brand recognition. They still benefit from the cross promotion of being able to make bundles. And hey, if you click on Opie Man's, developer page on Steam, you're going to see that, hey, if you like Fresh Woman, you're going to like our other game. But the other game is new, and Fresh Woman season 2 is not new. So it's the same characters. It's it's the same stuff as before. So it's not to say that Fresh Woman season 2 is not going to sell very well and be worth making. It's just that like, I reject the idea entirely that developers are continuing to make the same game over long periods of time in order to make more money, because that's just objectively not true. I would assume it's because they really like that game and they like the characters and they want to keep working on that specific story. I think that's a much more likely explanation than it's an easy way to make money. Because the easiest way to make money is to make multiple games and put them on Steam, because they will promote each other.
Right. And, to cap it off, I just think about like how excited would people be if Dr. Pinkcake was coming out with a brand new game, brand new setting and story after having been tied to Being a Dick for so long.
Right.
The reality is it's going to be several more years at least for him to finish his project, most likely.
Right.
So we won't see that, if ever. He may just be done at that point. I know if I were him, I would be.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So another thing we wanted to mention, we've already kind of talked about it, which is like if you want to do something new in this space or innovative that's not traditionally what's successful based on your research, you're going to be taking on more risk, and that's fine. It just depends on what your goals are. If you want to like make as much money as quickly as possible, or if you want to make something innovative, you don't need that money. Whatever your goals are, that's fine. Just be fully aware of what you're taking on. And, with what comes to that is if you're doing something that's high risk, it's just like what they say, high risk, high reward. And if you want to take that on, that's up to you. But, just be ready to fail if it's not what people actually want. But you're trailblazing, so part of that can be fun too. A good example of a game that took some risks from a deviation from their first game is the people who made Slay the Princess. I forget what the first game was called. Do you remember?
Scarlet Hollow.
Scarlet Hollow, yeah. So Scarlet Hollow is like a much more complex game. It's like a Being a Dick, like 2D version of the game is my understanding. I haven't played it, but Slay the Princess is much more simple. And the game, like all the art, I think I read it was created in like 3 weeks or something crazy like that. They took their industry knowledge, their experience, their research, and they understood what they thought was going to take to make a successful game without putting a crap ton of effort into it. And lo and behold, yeah, that game took off. And it's not even an adult game as far as adult content goes. It's just a horror game, which is crazy.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfect example of if you do have a more risky or innovative idea, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, be honest with yourself. If your goal is to do this full time, you might want to save it for your second game, because the first game, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn from it. You're going to gain insider knowledge that you can only gain by actually selling a game and seeing what sells and learning like what things are hard to do and easy to do and worth it and not worth it. A lot of that can only really be learned by experience because it's specific to you and your game. So that's the reality too, is there's nothing wrong with wanting to do something riskier. I think it's just, I would say for us, that's kind of the approach we took, even though it was unintentional, which is that Prince of Burbia is a simpler and also safer game in that the fetishes are very popular and not really what we call like inoffensive. Like they're fetishes that even if they're not your thing, they may not turn you off from playing the game entirely. And we picked fetishes that are very undersaturated, but have a very loyal following. And it's a relatively simple game. It mostly rests on its amazing visuals. We invested a lot into that. And we learned a lot from doing it that we've now turned around and used in A Shot in the Dark, which is a more complex game. We were able to use that knowledge. It would not have made sense for us to make A Shot in the Dark as our first game. That would have been insanity. So, it's like, even look at Dr. Pinkcake. Being a Dick is a really crazy, complex game, but it's not his first game. He learned a lot, and you can see that. He learned a lot from doing acting lessons. So make your acting lessons first, then make your passion project or your kind of riskier game or your more complex game. Don't try to do it first. And also too, I know we wanted to make this point later, which is that your first game not only will teach you things for second game, but it'll pay for your second game. So it'll give you more resources in order to make that more complex game.
Another thing is, once you've decided on the vision that you have for your game, stick to it. Don't get wishy-washy. Don't let players in various forums or subreddits or whatever convince you to do something drastically different. The caveat I would say to that is, if you truly have something that is going to detract from your goals and creating the game and building your audience, then okay, that's something to consider changing. But if it's just your vision, your story, whatever it might be, yeah, don't do crowdsourcing. At least that's our opinion on it, because then your game is probably going to lose its soul.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important to develop like a strong internal filter to decide like what feedback is good and what isn't. I mean, the reality is, as humans, I don't think we're meant to take feedback from like hundreds of thousands of people, which is what happens when you put a game on the internet. I think the reality is like we've definitely taken feedback, especially when we think it's something that's going to make our game have a wider appeal. But we try to avoid taking feedback on things that we know would not have a good ROI, like return on investment. We know that they'd be like a huge investment of time and resources and probably wouldn't really net much of an increase in audience. So we tend to avoid those things, and also we tend to avoid things that we think would limit our audience by making the game more restrictive or more specialized.
One quick thing, like an example of this that we've experienced recently is we had a player that was requesting that we have essentially like 10 different camera angles for every lewd scene in A Shot in the Dark. And it's like, we can't do that. Like, that's a ridiculous waste of resources. We just have to move on, like 3 cameras or whatever, or 4 at a maximum for each scene, and just keep pumping out the loot scenes.
Right.
We can't stay on these loot scenes for extended periods of time needlessly just because some player wants a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, that's an ongoing balance that you have to strike, is that you're only one person, or in our case, 2 people. And, there's lots of suggestions that are totally valid and would be like nice things to do if you had unlimited resources, but you don't. So you have to pick and choose like what things are worth it and what things aren't. So, I think we've made it pretty clear. And if we haven't, let's hammer it home one more time, which is that in order to do this full time, basically the only path that we see is to make a game that can go on Steam. Trying to make this into a full-time job using Patreon and Subscribestar and Itch is really unsustainable. It's just almost next to impossible, especially now that the market is more saturated than it was when we started in 2017. But even then, the path to making it full-time on Patreon was basically already closing. And it became very clear to us once Steam started allowing adult games in 2018, and then it's now a very established market on Steam. There's just really no question in our mind. And that has always been our plan from the very get-go. There's nothing wrong with Itch and Patreon and Subscribestar. They're all great platforms, and they're great places to start out to get the funding that you need in order to get to Steam. And then even like in our case, we're on Steam, but we still maintain presence on those platforms because we do have very loyal fans on those platforms. And we like those platforms. It's just that like they were never going to sustain us full time on their own. And so they're a really great supplement and a way to get there. And then for us, they're a more steady source of income, whereas Steam is a little bit more like it fluctuates more. But, the ultimate goal has to be getting to the game onto Steam, because the audience there just completely dwarfs the audiences on all the other platforms combined.
I just want to say real quick, as far as making it on Patreon, I definitely feel like at this point, like you're saying, like that idea or that notion is pretty much over for the majority of game developers that are making adult content. That being said, if you have some sort of special sauce or novel thing that you have in your game, you do have a chance of making it big on there. It's just much slimmer than it used to be pre-pandemic.
Right. I also think too, though, like there are obviously new developers that are coming onto the scene that are successful on Patreon. And a lot of them really rely on putting out lots of content quickly and then using Patreon to give people like early access or special perks. So it's possible. And this is why I say there's no one right way to do it. And certainly like if that's your goal, is you should go find people that have made Patreon really successful and ask them how they did it. Patreon, becoming a top creator on Patreon was never our goal. Like, we like Patreon. It's a great place for us to interact with our really loyal fan base. I do like offering some perks to the people that have really supported us like as developers instead of just specifically like buying our games. So I love like Patreon as a platform, but because it's never been our focus, we haven't really optimized it. And so we're just not the right people to ask about how to optimize Patreon, because for us, it's always been like a really niche thing for us. Like, here's where we really interact with our most core supporters, but we're not trying to attract a large audience to Patreon. In my opinion, you can spend a lot of time optimizing your Patreon and making it really big on Patreon. But if you spent that same amount of time optimizing for Steam, your income potential would be much higher. So that's also the thing for me too, is like, okay, you can get to the point that you're making $10, $20, $30,000 a month on Patreon, but the amount of effort required to do that is like monumental. Like, you have to really be releasing content on a really regular basis. It has to be something really innovative and novel. You have to be spending a lot of time on. Also, you have to spend a lot of time promoting your Patreon, because Patreon does not promote you. So if anybody is coming to your Patreon, it's from external sources. Whereas like on Itch and Steam, only like 2% of our sales come from external sources. Most of our sales on those platforms are generated within the platform. And so in my opinion, all of the effort that you would put into optimizing for Patreon could be spent optimizing for platforms that will do more of the work for you and therefore introduce you to a larger audience. And you'll ultimately make more money in the long run. I don't have a counterexample for that, but that's my gut feeling on that.
Right. And to be clear, being a dick and Fresh Women on Steam, it's our assumption and that they've made a crap ton more money on Steam than they have on Patreon as a whole. As crazy as that may sound, because Dr. Pinkkick has a freaking huge Patreon. Another thing, though, too, to consider is like if you're making a game that for whatever reason can't be on Steam, then Patreon and Subscribestar might be your only way to make that kind of money.
Right. But that's why I would say like don't make that game, because then it's really hard to make it full time if you can't go on Steam.
The biggest example with that, of course, is Summertime Saga.
Right. So yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about what can and can't go on Steam? So I think that's really important for people to understand, is like, if you're going to make a game that can't go on Steam, like, again, you can try to make it big on Patreon, but it's an uphill battle. Like, if your goal is to make this your full-time job sooner than later, then you would really be shooting yourself in the foot to make a game that can't go on Steam.
Right. So for Steam, like, you're going to want to read the terms of service really carefully based on what you're saying, because they do paint a fairly clear picture as to what they allow and what they don't allow. And one of those big things is no underage content. And that includes like not having high school in your game, which is what Summertime Saga does. And that's one of the big reasons why you'll never see it on Steam unless there was a complete overhaul of the game, which most likely is never going to happen. There's some other popular games that have reached the same fate, even though I would assume Summertime Saga has never attempted to go on Steam. But like the game Myst, for example, that had a character that was perceived to be underaged, and they also referred to themselves as a lolicon, essentially. And that was the nail in the coffin when it comes to Steam, as far as never having the opportunity to come back on there because they had that in there. Some more things to consider is you don't want to have something, for example, that glorifies non-con and rape, because you're going to be risking yourself for actually being able to make it on the platform. A good example of a game that did glorify it that was banned from Steam ultimately was called Rape Day. You know, if you're going to try to push the envelope as far as that goes, you're going to probably reach the same fate.
One thing I'll say with that, though, is that from our experience talking to developers that have been through this process is, and even with ourselves, like, for example, in Prince Suburbia, there's some sleep sex. And so something that Steam had us do is that they had us be really clear in our adult content warning about specifically what type of content was in it. So I will say when it comes to things like non-con and like, you know, dub-con, dubious consent, or rape or things like that, I do think Steam is a little bit more flexible. They just want to make sure that you're fully warning players about what's in the game so they can make an informed decision. And if it does cross the line into like glorifying it, a lot of times they will ask you to go back and change it. Whereas when it comes to underage content, there is no recourse. If they find anything in your game that for them, it could be perceived as underage content, regardless of what the intention was, it is an instant ban for your game. And there is no way to ever reapply to get your game back on Steam. They will not let you change anything. They will not tell you what's wrong with your game. Like, they are extremely strict about underage content. And I'm under the understanding that it's because of the state laws in the state where they operate. Washington State has very vague language around underage content, and it includes it could potentially include fictional underage content, which is why they are extremely strict about it, because they're not risking their multi-billion-dollar business over some porn games. The other stuff for them, I think, is more of a gray area in that it's not illegal in their state. It's just that they want to make sure that they have a platform that, you know, is informative and is not like glorifying things that are going to bring them bad press. That's just been our experience, is that you can get away with a lot of things on Steam, and also incest is totally fine on Steam. I see that all the time.
Yeah, it's
a common misconception that people are like, oh, they took incest out of their game for Steam. Steam does not give a fuck. There is a game called Sisterly Lust on Steam.
Right, that's all you need.
They do not have a problem with that at all.
Yeah, that's all you need for the proof is go look at the game.
Right. Whereas, for underage content, they are complete no-go. They're kind of the opposite of Patreon in that regard, in that Patreon is much more black and white when it comes to incest and not allowing any incest content. Whereas when it comes to non-con and lolly on Patreon, it seems like they're a little bit more like they'll work with you to fix it or to get it into alignment with their standards. So they're just two totally different platforms in that regard. And if you have to choose between the two, choose Steam. Make a game that can go on Steam. And if Patreon doesn't love it, like, you're not leaving as much money on the table as you are if you get kicked off Steam.
Some other things to consider for Steam, like as far as making sure that your game is okay on there and that you're not going to encounter issues, is to try to avoid copyright violations. And that includes, like, unfortunately for the Honey Slug developers, they can't ever put their game on Steam unless those terms of service were to change, or if they were to somehow get permission from that company. Some more aspects that are more common are like stolen music or music that changes with their terms of service after the fact. There's definitely been games that have suffered from that. Leap of Faith is one of them. At one point or another, the developer had to take all the music out and strip it just to make sure that they had music that was good to go inside of the game later on down the road. And then another thing that you have to be careful of, which is something that's probably more obvious, is no parody or IP theft. If you're going to make something like stealing Disney characters, for example, and put them in a porn game, you better be ready for that game to be banned or to be taken down or to get some sort of legal action taken against you if your game somehow does make it out there.
Right. Yeah, those things are a little bit more wishy-washy on Patreon because Patreon is not a sales platform. And so people get away with more on there when it comes to IP theft or not having full music rights or using Honey Select and things like that. But those are definitely a no-go on Steam. But one thing that has changed recently since the last time that we recorded this is that before, Steam was being really strict about artificial intelligence, about AI content, and they've since changed their stance on that. So before, we would have said, make sure to not put anything AI related or AI created into your game, but it seems like Steam is softening their stance on that. For me, I think I would still be kind of wary of it. But again, the good news is with all of these things, Steam seems pretty willing to work with developers in that, like, if you do have some kind of claim against your music, then yeah, they'll let you take the music out and replace it. So there's a lot of, there is some wiggle room. Like, I think developers get really scared about even like applying to put their game on Steam. And it's like, Steam will work with you on a lot of things. The only thing they will not work with you on is the underage content. So that's the only one to just completely avoid, is anything that could potentially be construed. But everything else, Steam is actually pretty flexible.
Yeah, I think what has become clear over the past, maybe it's been since Steam's inception, but certainly with the moves they made in the past 5-10 years, adult games being allowed, AI art being allowed now, is Steam cares about making money. That's their number one goal. So if whatever you're doing is aligned with that pursuit and follows their terms of service and is legal, they're going to want to put your game on their platform so they can make money too.
Exactly.
And real quick with that, what comes with it is one part of their stipulation is they do not want you selling your game for less on other platforms. So keep that in mind if you are going to sell on other platforms other than Steam, to try to keep your price parity. You can still have sales on the platforms, but just have the base price be the same.
Yeah, that's another misconception I've seen is developers selling their game for less on itch. And their excuse is that itch takes less of a commission and therefore it's okay for them to sell it for less on itch. And I'm like, that's not how Steam sees it. Steam doesn't give a fuck about what commission you're paying to itch. They don't want people going and buying the game on another platform. So that one is, again, you don't want to fuck around with that. It's such a small thing, but people have a lot of misconceptions about it. So, we've talked basically per an entire podcast length now about all the things to think about before you even start making your game. And I think that that's something that probably when people think about marketing and business, they don't necessarily think about like how so much of that happens before you even start making your game. And I think for a lot of people, that's understandable, right? Even for us with Prince Suburbia, it wasn't like from the get-go, it was like, oh, this is definitely our ticket to full-time game development. It was like, hey, let's try this out and see how it goes. And so, there's nothing wrong with kind of coming to it a year or two or later in development and saying, hey, I wasn't really thinking about this in the beginning, but now I want to make this my full-time job. So if you're already making a game and you're already making something that kind of breaks some of these things we're saying, like it's a Honey Select game, so it can't go on Steam, or it's a high school game, so it can't go on Steam, or it's a really niche thing that is not super popular and doesn't really align with the things that are already for sale. The bad news is that there's nothing that we're going to tell you that's going to suddenly make your game super successful. Like, that's just not how marketing works. You can't market something that people don't actually want to buy. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is that you're in good company. People do that all the time, that they make something and then kind of later realize, okay, this isn't exactly what is like to market, because you don't really know either until you're on the other side of it and you can actually see what's selling and what isn't. So the reality is like, don't beat yourself up, but also don't kill yourself trying to market something or thinking that marketing is going to suddenly make it into a full-time job when that's probably not possible if you're being honest with yourself. So just focus on finishing that game and then using lessons learned and the money that you do earn from it to make a more successful second game. That's why we say that this is a long-term planning type of thing. This is a marathon. You may not even make it with your first game as far as making it a full-time job. And I think that's it's a pretty realistic expectation to think that you're going to have to make at least, be making your second game before you can make it a full-time job. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that you failed. Just take what you've learned and move on and do better with the next one.
So some things to consider for where you want to focus your efforts when it comes to like stores and platforms for your games. This is based on experience, so things that we've seen, which is you want to focus your efforts on itch and Steam. Itch is kind of like the testing ground. Like, you want to put your game on there to see how it's going to perform, because it's going to be a fairly close indicator as to like how it's going to perform on Steam. That being said, it does seem like itch has a bias towards 2D games over 3D games, so keep that in mind. If you have a 3D game that doesn't perform that well on itch, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to perform well on Steam.
Yeah. Although if you look at some of the most successful games on Steam, Being a Dick is not on itch, aside from that pirate that tried to pirate and put it on itch.
But it is on GOG.
It is on GOG. But, the other, I would say, biggest games on Steam, like Project Passion and Freshman, are both extremely successful on itch. So I do think it's a good proxy. It is true that 2D games have a little bit of an advantage on itch. Although I think 2D games honestly have a bit of an advantage on Steam too, just because 2D is novel.
Yeah.
So, we see that with our games, that even though Prince Suburbia is, probably by a lot of people's standards, not as high quality as A Shot in the Dark, it's 2D and it has really novel and unique and high quality visuals and a lot of adult content. And so that that makes it like a really good seller, even if it's not what people would objectively call like a good game. And I think that, in that way, both itch and Steam are very aligned in that they're, if you have adult content and you have good visuals, then both platforms do prioritize that. But I do think itch, you might get a little bit more of a bump from having a 2D game than a 3D game. And also too, I think along those same lines, I think queer games do better sometimes on itch than on Steam because there's more of an audience.
Yeah. And the market isn't super catered to, so they'll eat it up. Yeah. Another thing that's really important that, like we talked about before, there's a lot of people who don't follow this, which is you want to make your Steam store page as quickly as you can so that you can soak up wish lists and, put out announcements about your game and start drumming up hype and interest. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have a store page set up just a few weeks or even just like a month prior to you releasing, because then you're not going to give your game time to build up those wish lists. And one of the reasons why that's such a big factor is Steam has their hidden algorithm where if you hit like 10,000 or 15,000 wish lists, then you get promoted as upcoming games. Like, hey, this game's coming out, you're going to want to check it out. Versus if you don't do that, then you're not going to be promoted and you've essentially wasted your promotional period, your marketing, all for the sake of getting your game out.
Yeah, I see that so often, and it just kind of boggles my mind. I've seen so many people say like, oh, I just got really impatient. And that's why we're saying, like, if you want to make this your full-time job, like, you need to pack your patience, because like the whole point of itch and Steam is that they promote your game for you. I'm telling you here objectively, there is no way to market your game better than Steam can. Steam has a built-in audience that you will never be able to reach. And no amount of Twitter posts or Reddit posts or word of mouth is ever going to match the audience that Steam can put your game in front of. And so it's just insanity to not take advantage of that. You will never match it. And also too, when I see people being like, oh, I made my, Steam page, I'm trying to build wish lists. How do I do that? Just leave it there. Steam will put your game in front of people and they will wish list it. We've only seen the most minimal of bumps from external traffic trying to drum up interest in our wish list. We'll maybe get like an extra 50 wish lists that day. Who gives a fuck? If you're trying to build, like our goal was to get 40,000 wish lists for A Shot in the Dark. You're not building that 50 wish lists at a time. You're building that just over a long period of time of Steam showing your game to players, as opposed to you going through shit tons of effort to post on external sites and bring people in. That's a waste of your time. You could spend hours every day posting on every single social media platform to try to bring people into your Steam page, and you're still maybe only going to match what Steam can do on its own. So, you're better off spending that time actually developing the game than trying to beat Steam's algorithm or beat Steam's audience, which you just can't do on your own.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say, I honestly just think it's kind of wild, the developers that do that and just only let their Steam store page soak for 2 weeks before releasing or whatever. It's like, you're a game developer. Even if it is adult games, like, we know how much effort gets put into that. You just couldn't have a little more patience just for a little bit longer.
Right. Yeah, oftentimes these are people, when I go and I look and I see when they started their game, it's like they've been working on their game since like 2019 or something. And it's just like, oh my God, you've been working on this game for like 5 years, but you couldn't wait like 5 more months before you launched your game on Steam. Like, it's really like, that's probably the number one thing that you can do. Like, if there was basically 2 takeaways from this whole thing, it's make a game that people want to make and let Steam sell your game for you. Like, those are really the only 2 things you have to do on a macro scale. And if you don't do those 2 things, then like, I don't know how to help you, because they're really basic. Like, those are just the most basic things that you can do. And everything else, like, again, I think people expect when they hear people like, how do you market a game? It's like, oh, I'm going to tell you the secret sauce for like posting the specific Reddit post that's going to send millions of people to your game. Like, that's not how any of this works. Steam has millions of players already on its platform every single day. All you have to do is make it easy for Steam to sell your game to those players. You don't have to bring in the players from the outside. That's a waste of your time. Just take advantage of what is natively there for you to take advantage of. And the fact that so many developers can't do that, but then expect them to save themselves by posting on social media or Reddit. Like, I don't understand why you would want to kill yourself trying to bring in external traffic when Steam has it just sitting there for you to take.
And another thing with this, like taking advantage of Steam, like everything that it has to offer, is you want to pay attention to the events that they have. And some of the important events for these types of games are Next Fest, which is for any game really, Visual Novel Fest, and then sometimes they have like theme fests. anyways, you just want to be aware of what's coming down the road. Take a look at it. This is a part of your research. Make sure that you're taking full advantage and fully utilizing everything Steam has to offer so that you can make money, and that's essentially Steam will make money off of you, and you'll both be happy.
Right. Yeah. Steam wants to sell your game because they want to make money. So, along with that, like the best thing that you can do again is make it easy for Steam to sell your game. And that involves making a really good store page and a really good trailer. That's if you're going to invest time into something as far as marketing, that's probably the best place to invest your time is really good branding, really good store page. Go and look at the other successful games. What are they doing on their store page? I even, because I typically do the design for our store pages, I go look at the AAA games. What are AAA games doing? Like those people, they spend millions of dollars on marketing and advertising. So like they know what they're doing. So I'm going to imitate what they're doing because they have experts working on this. So, again, look at the people that are actually successful and then learn from them and, pick what works for you and do what's best for you in your game. But don't discount what other games are doing. Like you should be imitating them. You don't have to copy them, but you should definitely be looking at what they do. One of the biggest problems I see a lot with a lot of adult games on Steam is that their trailer doesn't have any adult content or very little adult content. And again, that's what sells these games is the adult content. I think Classy Lemon, who makes Project Passion, I think he even talked about this, about how he like made like a really cool cinematic trailer that took him like a long time to make. And then he and then just on a whim, he threw together a trailer that was just a bunch of his like sex animations spliced together. And I think he said it took him like 15 minutes or something. And then his sales or wish list or whatever it was like doubled, that is the reality is like, that is what sells these games. What makes a game really, really good might be other aspects, but what brings people in initially, like the cliche came for the porn, stayed for the story. It exists for a reason. So show them the porn. Along with this too, I see so many developers are afraid of like spoiling things. Like they don't want to show the sex scenes or the good parts because it will spoil things for players. And it's like, I don't think anybody's ever said that. Like, oh, the preview on Pornhub, now that I saw like a clip from the porn scene, now I don't want to watch that porn scene on Pornhub. Like that's not how this works. It's what entices people to actually play it. And if you don't share the good stuff from your game, like if you don't share the sex scenes, then other people are going to. Like that's what players share. When they share screenshots on Steam, on other platforms, they are sharing the best parts. So why would you let them capitalize on that instead of you? You should be sharing the best parts of your game when it comes to what's going to sell it, and that's the sex scenes. And if I had to give a specific recommendation, it would be for you to show a sex scene within the first like 2 to 5 seconds of your trailer. And also do not start your trailer with the name of your game or your studio. People don't give a fuck. They want to see what's in the game. And then they're already on your store page, so they know what the game is called. There's no reason to put that in the beginning of the trailer. If you feel like you need to put it in there, put it in the end. But your trailer should just jump immediately into the action. And that's true for AAA and, regular games as well. If you look at the best games, they typically just jump right into the action and they don't waste time with like this in the studio presents and then like 5 seconds of just the name of the game and crap like that. Like don't waste your time on that. Another thing that we do is that we have a free demo. I feel like this is really controversial because there's a lot of developers that seem to think that offering a demo makes their sales worse. If that's the case, then in my opinion, that feels like you're tricking players, which I don't love. So this is a place where, again, we're not always necessarily chasing the bottom line. I also have to be able to sleep at night. And so for me, ethically, like what I feel good about is offering a demo because then I know that the players that are actually giving us their hard-earned money for the game are doing it because they love the game so much that they actually want to buy it and play the rest of it. If that means that we get less sales overall, I'm okay with that, but that's just a personal choice that every developer has to make.
Yeah, at least as far as how Steam classifies it, it seems like they get more gross sales, but not necessarily net sales, like after the refunds. And that is one thing that, at least based on the other information we've seen posted from other developers who do not have demos, is that our return rate is lower significantly than those who do not have a demo.
Yeah, our return rate is like half as much as some developers. So whether they're actually earning more money or not, for me, is not really a consideration in that, like, I want my game to sell on its merits alone and not based on tricking people. So, and I'm not saying that developers that don't offer demo are tricking people. It's just that that's how I would feel if I were doing that. And I don't want to feel that way. So it's just a personal choice in how you feel about it.
And even if you don't want a free demo all the time, you're still going to have a demo and a store page for that demo for those events that we were talking about, like Next Fest and Visual Novel Fest, because you won't be able to participate in those without it.
Right. Yeah. And the reality is we don't have a counterexample because, we just don't know what our games would sell like if we didn't have a free demo. But, the reality is like we've had like over 1 million downloads at this point. And yeah, only I think 10% of those have converted to paying sales. And so it'd be easy to be like, oh, that's a 90% fail rate. But the reality is like, we just don't know what our actual sales numbers would be if we didn't offer that demo. So yeah, the reality is if you offer something for free, you are going to have a very small conversion rate to an actual paid product. That's true across all industries. But yeah, we don't have a counterexample to know, like, would our actual sales numbers be lower without a demo? We just don't know.
The main scenario where I can see not wanting to have a demo make sense is if you just have a really short game.
Right.
Because you don't want players to be able to see your entire game or half of the game or whatever in a demo, and then they could just buy your game and refund it and see everything.
Right. So yeah, this is one of those things where, I know most AAA studios do not offer demos. And so you could take that as a sign that it's not a good business decision. And that may be true. Again, like for us, it's not always about what's the best business. It's about what makes us feel good. So, you're always having to balance that. And for me, yeah, it's more of a feel good psychological thing to offer a demo. I don't really care how it affects our sales one way or the other. So you have to make a personal choice on that.
Another big point that you're going to want to consider is to harness the players that are already playing your games. And a part of that includes linking to the platforms inside of your game. You can't do this on Steam, but you can do this on other storefronts, obviously including Patreon and Subscribestar. Itch allows this too. Another thing is to ask for reviews in your game. That's something that's worked for us and works for other game developers. You can do that on Itch. You cannot do that on Steam. One thing you can do on Steam that we highly recommend is to prompt players to wishlist and or buy your games on Steam. And you can provide direct links in your game to do that, and there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, Steam probably wants you to do that because that's going to make them more money too. Another thing to consider is, this is just like the demo thing, it's controversial as to which way is better, is taking advantage of early access. Early access is nice because you get extra promotional periods, essentially, by doing early access. You don't just release your game and then that's a one-shot. Early access, you update your game and then you can talk about it. You can have your announcements. And then also, inside of the Steam backend, there are those actual promotion periods. That's the technical aspect that you can put or toggle it on, and you get like 3 weeks where they promote your game, essentially. You can still do that with a full release game too. It's just you're naturally taking more advantage of the promotion periods when you do have early access.
Something else that we would recommend is, for us, it's always been important to us to make our games as accessible to a widest audience as possible. And so, something that we kind of have, our mind has kind of changed on it over time is making our game fun for as many different types of players as possible. I think this is just kind of my perception of things, and this does not apply only to the adult gaming world, but I do feel like there's kind of this perception in the gaming industry, especially actually in non-adult games, of like, the game is meant to be played a certain way, and it's meant to be played in the way that developers intended it to be played, and anybody who tries to play it in a different way is like wrong and or like they just shouldn't play it. And I mean, it's a valid way to handle it from like an artistic standpoint. Like, yes, this is the artistic vision of the developers, and if you don't like it, then just don't play it. But from a business standpoint, to me, it makes sense to make your game as accessible to as many types of players as possible. And so to me, that involves like, for example, A Shot in the Dark is a game with a lot of branching, and a lot of players really like that. They like having lots of different choices that have a lot of impact, and then being able to replay it multiple times, and, having to find all the little, paths less taken in order to get all the achievements and that kind of thing. But I also recognize that there are players that just want to play it through one time and see a majority of the content. And, they're also players that I want to play the game. And if they like the game, I want them to give us their money. And so I'm not afraid to make our game accessible to that type of player as well. And I don't think that dilutes the player, I don't think that dilutes the game for the other players. I think you can make a game that's accessible to lots of different types of players, and still maintain the original artistic vision. So especially when it comes to adult content, you just have to recognize that a lot of people just want to get to the good stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we are unapologetically making an adult game to be consumed as an adult game. So yes, while it does have other aspects that go above and beyond the adult content, like a branching story for those players to enjoy, like that's great. But I'm also not like ashamed to say that, yeah, there's probably players that just want to skip through and find the sex scenes. And so we try to make that easy for them too. Another thing to consider is having like a walkthrough or a guide. That's a big thing on Steam is offering a guide for like a small DLC. I think that's just a really nice thing for players. Again, they don't want to spend all day on your porn game. Like if they want to get all the achievements, like they want to be able to find them quickly. So again, I don't think it's cheating or bad to allow a guide or to basically add like mods to your game to make it easier to play. say, I think you can do that without guilt. And the players that don't want to use those features just won't use them, but the players that do want them will appreciate them. And then same thing with that is like really good user experience, user interface, or what we call UX, UI, and aesthetic appeal. For both of our games, we have invested, once we had the resources, in an outside person to help us with that, because that's just really important. Players want to feel good when they're playing your game. They want it to be easy to navigate. And this is another example though of like, you don't have to get everything right from the beginning. You can always go back and change things later, which is what we've done. Both of our games, we did our own attempt at UX, UI, which was competent, I think was the word that the person who helped us used. But like, we want more than competent. So when we had the resources, we hired an actual expert to come in and make it better.
Yeah, to be clear, that was for Shot in the Dark. Prince of Burbia, we never really attempted to spruce it up until we got somebody to handle it for us. One really big factor that you're going to want to focus on is like when you have the time and the capacity to do so is to translate and localize your game. And the reason for that is it's a no-brainer. Like, you want to expand your audience that's willing to pay for your game, your potential customers. And if you don't take advantage of that, you're literally leaving tons of money on the table.
Especially with Steam, because they have a humongous international audience.
Right. With that being said, it can be difficult, especially if your game has a lot of stuff in it. If your game is more complex and you have a bunch of sub-menus and stuff, yeah, it's going to be time-consuming. It's going to be a lot. If you have a game that's very wordy, that's going to be more expensive, naturally speaking, than a game that's more based on visuals and maybe like grindy, let's say an RPG Maker game. That all being said, if you were to focus on it and you have limited resources, financial capacity to do so, I would say we would both agree you're going to want to make simplified Chinese your number one priority. That's what's going to net you the most bang for your buck. And then you can expand upon that based on your research. If you look at similar games of what kind of languages they have and how successful they are. One important thing to add on to that is only 30% of our sales for our translated game are from English-speaking countries. So that's Prince of Burbia. It's just crazy, like how much our audience, like how much bigger it is just by the sheer nature that we have it translated. If we just had it English only, it would be so crazy, like ridiculously lower. And one big example there too that we haven't mentioned already is like Fresh Women. Like, it has translation, it has localization. Being a Dick does not. Just think about how much bigger Being a Dick would be if it had all the translated languages that Fresh Women does.
Right. That's such a great point too. Yeah, I forgot to mention that earlier too, which is when I see players lamenting like, well, how come Fresh Women has, over 1 million units sold, compared to, Being a Dick probably has like a similar number of units sold, but like over a much longer period of time, and has probably leveled off more. And that is a big piece of it, which is that Fresh Women is in lots of languages. And yeah, Being a Dick is only in one. And so, same thing goes for us with, Prince of Burbia and A Shot in the Dark. Right now, A Shot in the Dark sells less than Prince of Burbia, although, it's only in English. So we will find out when we actually translate it, like how much that increases our sales. But I fully expect, based on our experience with Prince of Burbia, that it's going to at least double them, because that's what happened with Prince of Burbia. Just to give numbers to it, I think like 30-ish% of Prince of Burbia is sold in English-speaking countries. Another 30 to 40% is sold in Chinese-speaking countries, or countries in which Chinese players are using probably VPNs to buy the game. That in and of itself is, already doubling your market if you just do that one language. And then a lot of times though, I see people being like, well, is it really worth translating into like French or Italian or some of these smaller languages? Because, that's only like, for us, that might only be like 2 to 5% of our sales. And I would say it's one of those things where, again, this is not like where you start, but if you have the resources, then there's really no downside to then translating to those additional languages, because they do add up. So, if you have 2%, 3% here, but you have 10 languages with 2 to 3%, well, that's another 20, 30% of your revenue. So, again, it's one of those things that it's not like your first goal, but it's an eventual goal that, like, when you have the time and resources, this is the next stage, is where you really ramp it up, is with the translation.
And one last point with the translation is, you're going to want to make the business decision. Like, do I want to translate with each episode that I have, or do I want to just wait until I finish the game and translate it at that point? And I think it's pretty obvious, but I'll state it, which is, if you're going to release translation updates with each update that you put out, it's going to be more time consuming and more difficult and more tedious. If you wait until your game is finished then obviously it's a one shot, one deal kind of thing, and it's easier. But you're losing that promotional period as you make those updates with the translated updates.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of this just comes down to what your personal goals are. Like I think, from the way we see it, it's like it already takes multiple years to get to the point that you can make this a full-time job. And so for us, in order to make it a sustainable full-time job where we know, hey, for the foreseeable future, we're not going to be at any risk of needing to like stop doing this full-time and going out and getting quote unquote real jobs. And so for us, that involves doing things like early access and translation where, we're making that money over a longer period of time as opposed to like waiting until everything is done to make that money. If you have the patience or the time or the resources to wait until your game is finished, which will probably take multiple years in order to do some of these things, like put it on Steam or translate it. I mean, more power to you. I don't think that it's a bad thing per se. It's just that like, if your goal is to make this your full-time job as quickly as possible, like quick being relative because it's still going to take you probably multiple years, being able to like translate as you go or put it in early access or release it in seasons, like these are ways that you can turn it into a sustainable business before the game is finished, which is kind of a unique feature of our industry, which is that it's so undersaturated and there's so many solo and small developers that you can make it a sustainable job before the game is even finished. And I think that's a really cool thing about this industry. So it's, it's worth considering if, it's not something that you need to avoid. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with waiting until you're done to translate, but who has that kind of time? I don't know. That's a long wait to wait. So, again, we've talked for a long time specifically about like what game to make and then how to best utilize Steam, which I think probably most people were not expecting when it comes to like, how do you market a game? But like, that is what marketing is in this industry. And I think for the most part, most gaming industries, like I don't think it's actually all that different for AAA and indie games. I think they are very heavily relying on platforms to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them. And some of the things that they rely on, we can't rely on, like Twitch streamers and YouTube streamers. Like that's just not going to be a viable option for us. Even on social media, there's a lot of censorship. So you're not really ever going to be able to fully utilize social media to really push people to these platforms. Even if what you're advertising is the safe for work content from your game, a lot of platforms will not allow you to advertise what eventually leads to adult content. So like YouTube, it's very easy to get demonetized. We've gotten strikes lots of times for linking to our games by accident or whatever, even though we know better, but it happens. And YouTube does not want you using YouTube to send traffic to an adult game. So, the reality is like social media, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, all of these places, Discord. In my opinion, it's important to have a presence on those platforms. But that's more about retaining your current audience than it is about getting new audience. So people that are already interested in your games, they want a way to follow you and to get updates about the games, especially since, development goes on for a long time. So the reality is you do need to maintain a presence on those platforms. But again, I hope it kind of brings some relief to developers, which is that you don't need to put a ton of thought into it. You don't need to be putting out super unique, high quality content. You don't need to be spending hours and hours a week, every week, putting out social media content because it's not bringing in new players for you. It's just a great way to engage with your current base and to make sure that the players that already want to play your game or are already playing your games, like know about your new stuff and are like excited about what's coming. But, again, I hope that takes the pressure off as far as like, you're not gonna make this a full-time job by advertising on social media. And so the fact that you probably aren't, like, you don't need to feel guilty about that because you're not missing out on anything. I do see like there's a couple of threads on the developer forum on the most popular pirate forum, talking about like Reddit and itch and like sending people from Reddit to itch or sending people from Instagram to itch and things like that. Obviously developers find some success with it. So it's not like if you put an ad on Reddit and you do a good job with it that you're going to get 0 players. But when I see the numbers in those threads, again, I'm just kind of like, okay, but for like you put in all that effort to get like a few thousand more views. Like again, we get 10, 20, 30, sometimes 50,000 views a day on Steam from internal traffic. So why would I waste hours of my life making Reddit posts when it's only going to send a few hundred or a few thousand players when I can just get that for nothing by just making my game and putting it on Steam. So it's all of it is a kind of a calculus of like, what is a good use of your time? And I would argue that the best use of your time is always developing your game, making a really good game, developing it more quickly. And then, if you are going to put effort into external things, it should mostly be about making it easier for Steam to sell your game to players by having a good store page and a good trailer and things like that. Like I said, I looked it up this week and only about 2% of our sales on itch and Steam come from external sources. So it's, we could invest really heavily in that and potentially bump it up to like 3 to 5%, but like, who cares? Like we could also take those hours and just develop our games. And that's a better use of our time.
Yeah, I would say like the promotional posts on Reddit to promote your game, like especially if your game is newer, you could take an aspect of that and be like, okay, I want to get the word out that my game exists. So, okay.
I agree. That's a good point. I should have caveated with that. Yeah.
And then, okay, sure. But once your game is established, and certainly once your game is selling on Steam, like you're making enough money and you don't need that kind of influx. Like people are going to know about your game if your game is good and people want to be playing it. They're just going to talk about it in their circles. They're going to talk about it in the subreddits like lewd games and avian lovers and all that kind of stuff, if that's the type of game. So yeah, I would say, yeah, if your game is in the earlier stages and you want to get the word out, that's the time to do it. We've already tried promoting the games, and that's our experience too. You don't want to be investing that time after that fact, based upon what we've seen.
Right. That is a good caveat, which is that, yeah, if you're not on Steam yet, and so you're just relying on itch and Patreon to make your living, and you're trying to make a full-time living from that, then yeah, you are going to have to push external traffic to Patreon. For example, Patreon has no internal traffic. They actually hide NSFW creators from their own search results. So you're literally generating no internal traffic on Patreon, and it's all coming from external. So yes, if that's your goal, is to make Patreon your source of income, or like your source of income until you get on Steam, then you might benefit from some external traffic. But, and so again, we say this as people that have tried this. We did spend a lot of time, especially before we were on Steam, trying to drive traffic to our itch and Patreon, because we kind of overestimated how important those were. In hindsight, again, we could have just spent that time just developing the games and getting closer to Steam and getting closer to a point that we could get on Steam. So, again, it's kind of like, how patient are you willing to be? If you're willing to go a little bit slower with your development in order to put more effort into advertising on social media, then you could potentially like grow your Patreon and itch to the point that it can support you barely, for a while until you get on Steam. But I think it's also a totally valid choice in hindsight to just say, I'm not going to waste a lot of time on advertising. I'm just going to focus on making my game as quickly as possible and just getting it to a state that it can get to Steam, because you can't put really early games on Steam. They do need to have a substantial amount of content. So, again, it's only a personal calculation that only you can make as to what is the good use for your time. But I just want to dispel this idea that you're going to somehow advertise your way into a full-time job. That's not the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I will say definitively for myself, like I definitely have regret as far as how much time I spent personally on these Reddit promotional posts. And if I could go back, I would just have stuck to it for the first couple updates for Prince of Burbia, for example, and then I would have just left it alone after that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is kind of a do as we say, not as we do, which is that, take it from us. We have spent a lot of time trying all different types of advertising and marketing, like the more traditional types. And yeah, none of them could hold a candle to what Steam could just do on its own. So yeah, in hindsight, we should have just spent more time just getting ready for Steam and maybe gotten on Steam a few months earlier, and all of that advertising would have been totally moot.
And just to hammer home some of that stuff, Jocelyn's already talked about YouTube and how it has to be safe for work. And then even then you get dinged sometimes. Another example is you can't use traditional marketing like regular games can that don't have this kind of adult content, which is Twitch. So you can't send out your keys to these Twitch players and expect that they're going to play these games on the Twitch channel, because ultimately you're going to need a safe for work version, and you would have to create that technical aspect in your game. And for some games, like maybe the adult content is so focused that it's almost impossible. So that's something you have to consider. Like you can't utilize that. And then for some games, they're able to contact these influencers or these YouTubers that have bigger channels. And if they're lucky and the stars align, like with MXR Plays, for example, and Fresh Women, they were able to get viral essentially. But MXR Plays has also done that with other adult games, and they did not go viral after that. So like I said, the stars aligned for Fresh Women as far as that goes. Their video got 1 million views or something crazy like that, and they took off. So, but for most, it doesn't work out like that.
Right. Yeah. Another thing too, this is, and I say this as we had the same misconception, which is if we made safe for work versions of our games, then we could have YouTubers play them and Twitch streamers play them, and potentially even put them on safe for work platforms like Nintendo eShop, or the Apple iPhone store, or the Android store, or whatever. And the reality is, what we've learned over time is that that's just not a good use of your time. It's a lot of work to make safe for work versions of adult games, especially if you're making an adult game that is unapologetically an adult game with lots of adult content. And could our game stand on its own without the adult content? Maybe, but why would we bother? We're making an adult game. We should be selling it to an adult game audience. And the reality is non-adult game audiences don't want to play your adult game without the adult content. Like that's just not really true. Like I know it feels good to think that they might, but it's just not the reality. And it's just not a great use of your time. In the time that you spend making your game safe for work and then putting it on these other platforms or getting it out to Twitch streamers and YouTubers and all that kind of stuff, in the time that you spent doing that, you could just make more game. You could make more of your game, make your game faster, make another game. And, the adult game market is plenty healthy. Steam does a great job of selling to that market. And, you really you don't want to spread yourself too thin. So in our opinion, the best use of your time is to just unapologetically lean into making an adult game on the markets where adult games are sold, which is primarily Steam and itch, and, utilizing Patreon and Subscribestar, and not to waste your time worrying about trying to get your game onto the other platforms where, there's a bigger audience, but they're not looking for your game. So they aren't going to care about your game. And the reality is the standards for non-adult games are much higher. And I have yet to see, as much as players want to think that, some of their favorite games would stand on their own without the adult content, I have yet to see an adult game that, if you took all the adult content out, would really stand alongside some of these more polished, AA visual novels like Life is Strange or Slay the Princess, or, these ones that are just really, really good games on their own and they don't have any adult content. I mean, I'm including ourselves in this category. This is a different industry with different standards. Our games just don't stand on their own without adult content. And if you can make a game that stands on its own without adult content, or doesn't, if you can make a non-adult game that sells really well, then go do that, because the market cap is much higher outside of the adult game industry. So if you're talented enough to make a really good indie game, then just go do that. Don't waste your time in our industry, because they're different animals. And, I think it's a waste of time to try to break into the non-adult market with an adult game. If you want to break into the non-adult market, just make a non-adult game.
We've already talked about this a little bit here in this podcast. But game development, adult games, regular game development, doesn't matter. It's all a marathon. Unless you're making an extremely simple game, it's not going to be a sprint. It's going to take a long time. You have to buckle up, dig deep. It's not going to be something that you can just put out overnight. And you're going to have to go through some tough, tedious times with this game development. It's not going to be fun. Hopefully you're the type of person that can brace for that and understand that, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but you're going to have to work a lot to get to that. You're not, just like with anything that takes a lot of time and effort, you're not going to be able to just live off of passion to get to the finish line. You're going to be on fumes at some point, and you're going to have to, like I said, dig deep in order to continue after that. And then, like we said earlier, the successful developers who reach success, whether it's with the reviews and people raving about the game or the financial success, they're the ones who have completed games that didn't give up. There's a lot of games in the industry where, they have one or two updates, and then for whatever reason, they can't stomach it anymore. They don't have the energy to continue, or life happens and they decide it's just not for them anymore.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest advice that we can give, is just don't give up. Like I said, I hate to say that things are guaranteed, but if you look around the space, pretty much any developer that has put a completed game onto Steam is doing this full time. Even amongst the developers that aren't using Steam, like some of the bigger Honey Select developers and things like that, there are very few that are not on their second game, that are not, making enough to do it full time, even if their income potential would be higher on Steam. So, that's just the reality, is that it takes multiple years to finish a game. And very few people ever get to that point. But if you just don't give up, if you finish a game, this is an industry that really rewards that. And so if you can just get yourself to that point by whatever means necessary, and sometimes passion will fuel you, and sometimes it'll just be gritting your teeth and getting through it. But if you can get to that point, then in my opinion, success is almost guaranteed. I think if you do those three things, if you finish a game, if you make a game that can go on Steam, and you make an unapologetically adult game, I have yet to see an example of somebody that does all three of those things who is not doing this full time. And again, does that mean that they're going to be a multimillionaire? No. But becoming a full-time game developer is a really hard task to set out to do. And so to achieve it at all, is a huge accomplishment. Finishing a game at all is a huge accomplishment. And so, that's what I would say, is just, that's what I tell developers, aspiring developers, over and over again, is just don't give up. Don't give up after that second update, when, sometimes the reception is kind of lackluster. Players are really skeptical of games, until they reach at least the halfway point in our experience, because they've been burned many times, and these games do take a long time to develop. And, there are so many games that get abandoned after the first update or the first year. I wouldn't worry too much about what your success looks like after those first few updates. I wouldn't worry too much about what it looks like. Your reception on Patreon is not super important, or how people talk about it or don't talk about it on various platforms. Like, none of these things really matter. All that really matters is your reception on Steam. And again, I have yet to see a developer who actually takes the time to make their store page ahead of time, gives their wish list time to build, and then puts their game on Steam. All of them have reached their financial goals by doing that. The ones, in my experience, that don't reach their financial goals on Steam are the ones that just weren't patient enough to give Steam time to do its work, or they're not fully utilizing Steam to its full potential, in that they have really crappy store pages, or they don't have great trailers, or whatever. Like, it's just, there are lots of developers that fail in this industry, but in my opinion, if you go and look at their situations, it's very obvious to me why they're failing, and it would only take a few small changes to get them to success. So, again, I hate to say that things are guaranteed, but I do think that there's just basically a few things that you can do that will almost guarantee that you can get to a full-time job. They're not easy. Don't get me wrong. It takes a long time to develop a game. It takes a lot of effort to make a good store page and trailer and make a game that people want to play. These are all hard things, but they're not impossible. And they just require a little bit of planning and intentionality.
One thing to consider too is early access does have a little bit of a bad rap on Steam, because there's some developers who do not complete their game, and then players feel burned at that point. So just understand, if you do choose that route, that you're gonna have to fight against that a little bit. So if you have a really long time in between your updates, Steam players may come at you and be like, oh, they're never gonna finish, something like that.
Yeah.
But to reiterate on what you were saying about completing the game and getting it done, it can be psychologically motivating once you complete that first game. Be like, oh, I've done it once, I can do it again. And just get easier and easier at that point, with your mindset of knowing that you can do this, even if it does get hard and tedious again in the future. And another big point to take from all this too is, with your first game, take all the stuff that was good from it and try to bring it again into your second game, and then iterate on it and make improvements upon it, because it's a proven thing that you've reached success with at this point. And maybe some of that stuff can be known as like your brand and what you offer in the industry.
We hope this shed some light onto how to make adult game development your full-time job, if that's your goal. It's definitely not easy, but we do believe it's very possible if you're motivated. The good news is that you don't have to be perfect at it or always make the best decisions. We are the perfect example of that. We didn't know a lot of what we know now starting out. There's a lot of things that we would do differently if we could go back and do it again, but it doesn't matter, because we've been successful. It's working for us. And, we made just enough good choices to balance out the bad ones. And, we've learned enough along the way to keep improving and doing better. And, if we can do it, certainly anyone can. We are not like special superheroes. We're just, we're just people that were willing to put the time in, put the research in, and just not give up even when it got hard.
If you have more questions or topics you'd like us to explore, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We hope we planted some seeds with you today. See you next time.
Bye.